Hello. Today I'm going to do another book review of The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way by Amanda Ripley. Just so you know, my au pair children, when I was in Germany, they decided to draw on that, so pretend that's not there. But anyway, this is a fantastic book because I think it gives you a global perspective of how education is valued and what the curriculum looks like and the culture of education looks like around the globe outside of the United States. I'm very fascinated because I feel like when we're looking at how we can improve our own systems, whether it be, foreign language studies, whether it be like how we can get students to be more proficient in math and science and things like that. It really kind of gives you more of a perspective of what other people are doing and not getting results and how we in our own countries can actually make that happen. So I highly, highly recommend this book. I'm actually reading this a second time right now and making more notes on this for my own personal research as well. And so what's really fascinating about this book is because it also, so Amanda Ripley, she mainly is a journalist, and she mainly does stories on human behavior and public policy. And so she has a pretty good resume. I mean, she appeared in Time, The Atlantic, Slate, has made appearances on ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, NPR, She has a pretty good resume in terms of like her own aspect of research and journalism. And so the book, it really follows like some of the groundwork that she's done in terms of like investigating through, with parents, children, and, data analysis in terms of like discovering what makes kids smart, especially across different cultures. And a part of like, while she's doing that, interviewing these different people, she's also following 3 different high school students who are studying abroad in different countries. Like I think there's one who's in Finland, there's another one who's in South Korea, and another one that's in Poland. And she kind of follows their experiences over their semesters, and kind of like what their experiences were, and specifically with the education culture, and as well as following these different people she talked to. It's great because it starts from the PISA test. PISA, it stands for Program for International Student Assessment. It's talking about other international tests in comparison. It says that those tests usually quantify students' preparedness for more schooling, not their preparedness for life. None measured teenagers' ability to think critically and solve new problems in math, reading, and science. The promise of PISA was that it would reveal which countries were teaching kids to think for themselves. And I think that's really an interesting aspect because a lot of times it feels like, specifically from my experience in the American, the U.S. Education system, is that the focus has pretty much been on standardized testing as in what you know versus how to apply what you know. Like one of the things that when I grew up, I remember hating standardized testing. I hated the ACT because I didn't really do really well on both times I tried it. I had a high GPA, but my ACT, SAT scores were low. And they actually mentioned that in my college interview when I went to, before I went to FITM. Like, your GPA is really high, but your ACT score is really low. Like, what's that about? And I was like, I really don't like standardized testing. And the main thing is, I felt like when the questions that they're asking, I'm like, I'm never in my life going to come back to this. Like, I mean, the Pythagorean theorem, we're taught that they make us memorize these formulas for things. And it's like, when am I ever going to use that? I've never had to be like, oh, you know what really solved this problem? The Pythagorean theorem, I feel like it's a lot more on factual things versus like life skills and, thinking critically. When I was in college, I had to take a general studies class called critical thinking. And I was like, this is so dumb. Like, don't people know how to do this? no, there are actually a lot of people in the world who do not know how to think critically and think in a way where, think for themselves in many ways. I realize that that's not the case in those aspects. So I felt like, that was new to me. Yeah. Well, it wasn't really new. I mean, that was something that I knew or I had felt, but it was like, wow, this is a confirmation of yes, affirmation of my own point of view. I'm trying to scoot up my chair. My own point of view regarding standardized testing, because I absolutely could not stand it. And basically it's like the number one country that did really, really well consistently was Finland. And I was surprised because I didn't know that. I'm like, Finland of all places? I'm like, that is odd. But yeah, and they kind of explain why, since one of the students she's following goes to Finland. And it goes into detail of how she raised money to do this trip, and how they were able to kind of what they ended up doing. Because there's one point where, there's a point where, they talk about exchange programs before she ended up the student particularly decided to go. And it records a conversation that it says Kim told her sister she wanted to leave Sallisaw in Oklahoma. I'd like to live somewhere where people are curious. Kate listened and nodded. She was a woman of action. She worked a retail job on her days off. She liked to jump out of planes and explore caves. In her opinion, if Kim wanted to go away, she should think big. Why don't you become an exchange student? You mean go to another country? In her head, Kim imagined a kid with floppy hair and leather flip-flops backpacking around Europe. Why not? Kim laughed. Rich people do that. We don't do that. And so it later on goes to say that she learned that 1,000 or 2,000 American high school students went abroad each year. She found AFS one of the largest exchange programs by reading the blog of an American girl posted in Sweden. So, I thought that was a really interesting perspective, because when we think about studying abroad, I a lot of times encounter students or encounter other people who think that studying or even, just traveling internationally is something that wealthy people do. I know there's been a perception, maybe a historical perception of that, but when you really look deeper into why that is that I don't think it's really so much so as a wealth perception. It's more of a fact that, a lot of times when people who have money or have this perspective, is that they want their kids to be immersed. Even my parents weren't wealthy, they're not we're not millionaires, but I remember my brother when he before he went to Dubai, I remember my parents went to the meeting about it, because his academy, they do international trips every other year, and he did not want to go to Dubai because his friends weren't going. And my parents, like I said, they're not rich, we're not wealthy by any means, but my dad was like, you're going on that trip because it's the culture, the aspect of it. And just because your friends aren't going, that just doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and miss out on an opportunity. And, I feel like sometimes we kind of lose sight of that. We kind of think it's more of it's been associated as a rich people thing, but I don't think it's more of a rich people thing. It's basically an aspect of as they said, 1 to 2, thousands of students go abroad every year. People are going abroad every day, and we just sometimes don't even know it. So when we think about those aspects, is that, like I said, we associate it as a rich people thing, but it's just mostly parents who just want their kids to have a more wider perspective. Goes back to kind of those critical thinking aspects. And one thing that I think was really interesting when they talked about parent involvement is that, we think that being an involved parent is, oh, I'm involved in their PTA meetings. I pick them up from school, from their, I support all their sports and their extracurricular activities. But really and truly, the way that you can really be involved in your students' education is really just simply reading to your kids at night, reading to your kids at night. having dinner table discussions, like saying, okay, like we're having dinner and okay, like we're going to talk about our day. We're going to talk about what you learned, because it makes students think critically, and it also helps them form opinions and analyze what they've learned and summarize those kinds of things to solidify any information they've learned. So I thought that was really an interesting aspect. It's like, wow, so I don't have to be the person that's like the most involved parent in their extracurriculars. And actually, one of the things they talk about in this book is basically that in many countries, sports, like how in America we have like high school teams and, people are really competitive in that aspect. A lot of countries don't have sports. It's like sport, like let's say if your kid wants to play soccer, they go outside of school and they go to like a football club, or some type of like organization that basically has these different teams for them to kind of be a part of those activities. So it's not something that's a part of school. You go to school and you're only there to learn, and that's pretty much it. Also, really talk about like the different aspects of resources, because different countries, obviously under different political circumstances, there are a lot of different countries many countries, may have, they have a democracy style government, but at the same time is that their country and based on their culture, they value different aspects. So like, for example, some countries may have a more socialist kind of approach to education, and people kind of like get up in arms about socialism because it's not like socialism and communism are two different things. They kind of mish both together. Socialism as in like when it comes to government funding, because usually public education is generally funded by the government, is they distribute it to where it's not like, I know like in the United States, there are certain schools that may have, I think they call it redlining, where it's like some schools that live in like, let's say like more like low income areas, they may get less funding than schools that may be in like, wealthier zip codes, So, and that's just a fact. Whereas, other countries are like, everybody gets the same amount of resources. And also there's an emphasis on technology where we feel like, if we get all these smart boards and touch screens and laptops and all this technology, that's going to improve a student's education. And it just doesn't. It's just gadgets. It really boils down to how the teacher is, teaching the curriculum more than anything else. So I thought that was actually a really great point when we think about, those aspects of how we teach in the class. Like when we think about foreign language education, you really don't need, like for me, of course I teach my students online, but I just get a Google Doc sheet and I just type out what I'm talking about, or maybe every now and then I might show them videos or things like that. But I don't need anything extremely fancy outside of, my normal computer or things like that. I don't need to have like thousands of dollars worth of technology to teach something that I can basically do to myself. It's basically falling on the teacher rather than the technology and the resources. One of the things they talk about later on is that is how like in like the student who was in Korea, there was the fact that they put a whole lot of emphasis on the teacher. Like they have to go through, like it's very competitive to, like I think in Finland, it's like really competitive to get into education school because you're responsible for whether or not a student's going to be prepared. It's more of like as a teacher in the United States, it kind of feels more lax. Their pay could be better because a lot of times that's a big topic when it comes to teachers' pay. And it shows like basically what that country values, where you have like, where, you may have, like sports players, like NBA, NFL players that get paid millions of dollars, but teachers don't get that kind of funding. They don't get that kind of thing. Obviously, those are two different industries, but the aspect is when we look at like people who are getting paid the most, like in South Korea, it talks about this teacher who literally makes a $4 million salary because he's a good teacher. They test you, like in South Korea, they test you. They make you go through like some assessments, and they look at students' scores, and how well students do determines whether or not they keep you. I mean, could you imagine in the United States that our teachers that how the aspect that your salary and your ability to keep your job depends on how well you can get students to do well. And if students don't do well at all, like on average, you can get booted. So I think that's a lot of stress for teachers, but at the same time, it makes sense because you're in charge of someone else's education and how prepared they are going to be for life. One other thing that I thought was really interesting in the appendix, which is like page 229, it says 88% of those from high achieving countries said U.S. students place more importance on doing well in sports than students abroad, whereas nearly all students, 96%, from lower achieving countries said U.S. students place more importance on success in sports. I thought that was really interesting because in a way it's true. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about like how, doing well in sports, the fact that like NFL, NBA players are paid significantly more than teachers. And, I'm not trying to make any type of like I'm not hating on sports. I would say I thought that was really interesting because when we really think about it, I think that we do place a lot of emphasis on sports. So there's a lot of different aspects here that I learned, from reading this book and then also reading it again in much more detail, is that when you place, how we basically go about teaching our kids, what does parent involvement look like? And then also even like getting the students involved. Like one of the things that she was talking about that I thought was also really interesting was the aspect of like, we are always talking about like, we're always listening to the principal, the teachers, parents, when they're talking about like their kids' education, but they don't always ask the kids like, hey, how do you feel about your education? An emphasis on boredom, like things have to be, it's like when things are, really, really easy, students can get bored. It's like, this is not challenging. But if they're too hard, or too challenging, students can have tendencies to give up and finding that medium. She talks about how she was observing a classroom and she watched a student beautifully draw in ballpoint pen a tattoo on her arm. That kind of thing. How do you keep kids engaged in their own education as well? So I highly recommend this book because, again, it really gives us different aspects of how we can really be involved in our own education. What does international education really look like, and how we can emphasize that on our own international education here in the United States, and how we can improve that. So thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you check this book out. And I'll talk to you later in the next video. Bye.